Removing Barriers is a four-part series that seeks to inform and inspire people of faith to understand the fight against racism with an historical perspective coupled with personal witness and experience. The guests share their insights into the very prejudice that has plagued the nation and the world. Your program host is Father Jim Korda, president of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown.
Hello and welcome to our show, Removing Barriers. I'm Father Jim Korda. With me is Bishop George Murry, who is the chair of the Bishop's Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. Bishop, welcome.
Thank you very much, Father. Good to be with you.
I think for our discussion in the first part of our show, we'd like to give the folks that are with us an idea of what racism is all about. First of all, define the term and why is it so wrong and evil?
Well, those are very, very good questions. Let's begin with a definition. There are a number of functional definitions of racism, but the one which I have found to be the most useful is this, that racism equals race prejudice plus power. It's combining together race prejudice and power. Race prejudice is rooted in the belief that one race is superior to another. When that belief is imbued with power, religious power, social power, political power, economic power, racism results. Personal racism involves attitudes or actions taken by individuals to diminish the God-given rights of another person based solely on the person's race. Institutional racism is the application of racist attitudes or practices to structures or assumptions of an organization. Cultural racism is the application of these attitudes and practices to mores or standards or customs, languages and groups of people in society and how they behave. It's important to understand that there are racist ideas and there are racist actions. Racist actions grow out of racist ideas. But it goes back to that idea of race prejudice plus power. That is what creates racism.
Let's put this in a perspective. We know historically that we've dealt with this sin of racism and prejudice and abuse of power for centuries. Why are we finding ourselves in the 21st century still dealing with it after all of what we've known in the past and because of our history?
That's an excellent question. I think that many of us believed that progress had been made on this issue. After the Civil War, we went into the period of what was known as Jim Crow, and a famous American historian wrote a book called Nothing But Freedom. He talked about how African Americans in the South received freedom, but nothing else. Did not receive land, did not receive education, did not receive opportunity. As we have gone through the 20th century, and especially during the Civil Rights Movement, many of those attributes, opportunity, education, housing, were offered to African American people, and many African American people seized that opportunity. And so coming into the 21st century, many people believe that progress had been made. Unfortunately, in the last few years, there have been a number of incidences which have indicated that we haven't come as far as we thought we had. And Charlottesville, Virginia was only one example, but it was a stark and terrifying example of how far we still have to go.
I think in some of our later segments, we're going to focus a little bit more on those particulars in our recent history. But let's go back to the whole idea of how people actually experience racism. And it's not just the African American community,
right.
But many communities experience prejudice and an abuse of power. Why is this experience so troubling for us as human beings, and especially as Christians?
Well, I think that what you said there at the end is the root. As Christians, we believe that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God, and every human being is valuable because he or she is created in the image and likeness of God. What racism does is say that a particular person, an African American person, a Hispanic American person, an Asian American person, a Native American person, a Pacific Islander, that someone is less than someone else, that someone has superiority over these people, oftentimes described as people of color, and therefore these people can be pushed aside and can be ignored. And as Christians, we have to stand up and be very firm in our belief and in the living out of our belief that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God.
Let's talk about that whole sense of respect for human beings. And I believe that part of that respect is part of listening to people. And so often when we have power, as you use that word, we tend not to respect or listen to other people. Why is listening so important in collaboration and also in coming to solutions for this sin of racism and prejudice?
Pope Francis talks about listening a great deal, and he talks about it always as, by listening to another person, we come to understand that person, what's important to that person, what's of value to that person, what makes that person tick. And what Pope Francis says is that we have to listen to another person and understand them and then walk with them, what he calls accompaniment. We accompany them on the journey through life and accompany them on the journey of coming closer to God. So often when we talk about racism, which the American bishops have clearly defined as a serious sin, so often what happens is listening goes out the window. Interest in the other, the person who is different, goes out the window. So there's no exchange of ideas, there's no exchange of values, there isn't listening going on back and forth, there are just judgments that are made, stereotypes. You don't fit into this category. And that leads to behavior that is exclusive rather than inclusive.
In our last minute together, let's try to define, is racism prejudice, and is prejudice also racism?
Well, I would say that racism grows out of prejudice. And prejudice is that sense that there's something wrong with another person because he or she is not of the same race. And then once we have that idea that there's something wrong, behavior follows that. And that behavior can be extremely destructive.
And in closing, what would you like the folks to know that's a priority for us as Christians in response to this sin of racism?
I'd like the folks to know that Jesus calls us to love one another as God has loved us. God loves us individually and personally, and he is not concerned about where we came from or the color of our skin or the language that we speak. What he calls upon us to do and what he's going to judge us on is our ability to love each other as individuals.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Reverend Ed Weisheimer. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're going to basically now talk about different kinds of racism. And I think for the folks that are with us, they may find it startling that there's actually different levels and different types of racism. Let's begin by talking about some of those differences. What would you share with the folks that are with us about those particular differences?
Okay, well, the first thing I'd like to mention is the kind of personal dimensions and the interpersonal dimensions. My first ministry is as an associate pastor in Shaker Heights. And after one of the services, a white man came out and he spoke to the senior pastor, and I was listening in, and he said, "Did you see that couple?" I couldn't figure out what he did. "Did you see that couple?" Well, it turns out he was talking about an African-American man and a white woman. And he was, kind of aghast. And it ended up that he followed them home in his car. Well, there's an instance of a deep personal bias against blacks, in particular, I guess, about their relationship with one another.
Mm-hmm. Now, this type of racism seems to be pretty much pervasive in our communities. Why would that be? Why, especially people of faith, why would we have that?
Yeah. Well, Father Korda, I've been in ministry now for over 50 years, and I've grown in my understanding of the culture in which I was raised and how this came to be. And I now understand that I grew up in a racist society. So the context in which decisions were made, well, everyone, had a part of that racist culture within themselves. Now, fortunately, my parents taught differently, and the church helped me to understand that I'm, first of all, a child of God, and my parents taught me to respect all people. But it's a racist society in which I grew up.
Sure. Before the taping, we actually talked about two different distinctions. We mentioned the word prejudice and the word racist. Yeah. Is there a difference between the two?
Well, it's all of one, whole thing. But yes, there is differences, and it's good to understand it. Now I'm going to give you an example of one that's kind of on the borderline. It could be both and. When I was pastoring in Chicago, beginning a new congregation, I had a youth group called Taking Care of Business. And it was a mixed racial group. And so we took them out on a retreat. They'd never been outside the city, and just a little ways out into the suburbs. And so we said, well, we have a swimming day. So the group we went to go swimming, and we were stopped at the door. The man had seen that we had African-American young people in our group. He said they didn't allow them. So you see, there was a policy in back of that, and it showed you how that maybe it was personal prejudice, but it grew up into a policy and a manner of running their business. So that kind of really affected me too.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because while we don't have those blatant distinctions and prohibitions now, there's still that sense that you're not welcome here, or we don't want you part of this. And sometimes that type of racism is very blatant, and sometimes it's almost like hidden, but it's still there. So let's kind of talk about some of those types of racism. Let's talk about the blatantism of it all. Yeah. Are many people blatantly racist?
Well, I don't know that many people are blatantly racist, But what has occurred is that, the slaves were ostensibly freed after the Civil War in the 1860s. Well, clear up until 1960, we had de jure segregation. We had housing codes that prohibited blacks from buying into white areas. In the town I grew up in Columbus, the suburb of Arlington had laws on the books prohibiting the purchase of housing by African Americans or Jewish people. It was stunning for me to learn that. So now we have inherited 100 years of African Americans being second-class citizens. No, they're no longer slaves, but they are definitely not a part of the whole and seen as whole people in our society. And housing, I think, is a good example of that.
And I think the other area, when we talk about the sense of racism, not just in housing, but obviously in employment, in education, in opportunities, and that's not just for African Americans, but we see certainly this blatant racism at times among other minority groups. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's unfortunate, but in many ways, if you're different, you could be Catholic and be different in our society. I mean, that was quite a prejudice when I grew up as a Protestant. Out in San Margarita, those were Catholics, and they were different. And, we called them names and things, which I'm ashamed of. But nonetheless, this pervasiveness of being prejudiced and then having policies that put in place the separation of people so that housing patterns became segregated, and we have ghettoized housing now. And blacks could not really benefit by the appreciation of their housing values like whites could, and I haven't benefited by that. That's a white privilege, Father Korda. But they have not been able to, move up and accumulate that kind of money through the appreciation of their housing, because it's been ghettoized, and it was first ghettoized by law. Now, 100 years later, it's not, but we have the inheritance of that big problem.
In just a minute,
yes.
What would you say that we need to do to work beyond that? What's some of the beginning things we need to do?
Yeah. Well, certainly we need parents who teach their kids respect for all people. We need to recover our history and be more honest about what American history has been and what it means to all groups in our society. And the church has a major role in doing that. And the church needs to educate their members and make witness in society as to all of us are children of God, and we're all one. So I think those are fundamentals, Father Korda, that we need to address.
Reverend Weisheimer, thank you so much for your input and your insights, and also for highlighting the necessity that we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Thank you very much for listening to me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they have so much wisdom to share.
The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block, or around the world. Share the joy. Church World Service.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Reverend Dr. Robin Woodberry. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're going to continue our discussion on racism. And the one thing that I'd like us to begin with is that whole concept of religion and racism. Sometimes it's at odds. And how do we reconcile the fact that as religious people, we need to be aware of some of these sins that afflict and affect our society, like racism?
Well, I think it's important for us to really go back to the Word as religious people. The Bible is packed full of stories and teachings on how to respect people who are different from us, whether they're from a different land. Paul, talks in Galatians about, whether you're Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female, whatever the case is, we're all one in the body of Christ. And if we can get back to accepting that principle, that teaching, and learn how to respect people, regardless of the differences, that will help us begin to address a lot of issues.
It's interesting. One thing that came to mind is oftentimes when I think of Christianity, I think of how we have to follow Christ. That's fundamental. When we think of religion, it's almost institutionalized. And sometimes when we think of Christians, we say that they're very religious, but they're not very Christian. And we get that sometimes. Why is it important for us as Christians to be very Christian and also very religious?
Because being Christian reflects Christ.
Right.
It reflects Christ, and that's what we should be doing. The love that has been extended to us, we ought to be able to extend to other people. I think we get lost in embracing diversity. It's okay to be diverse. Matter of fact, diversity is really a beautiful thing. Right. But what I think we allow to happen is allow diversity to cause division. And so we have to learn how to embrace diversity. So it's okay for people to worship differently than us. It's okay to have a different style. That's okay. Right. But respect each other in that diversity. And again, if we begin to do that, we can really begin to make some progress.
It's interesting. I've often wondered why it's difficult sometimes for people of faith to embrace that. Because we have an ideal, we have a Lord to follow. Why is it difficult sometimes to understand that we're all different, but we're all the same?
Yeah.
It's kind of an anomaly today.
Yeah, maybe because we all think we're right.
Good point.
And so, our way is the right way. And so, again, we have to get past that. We just have to do that. Doing ecumenical work is a great way to start to do that, because it puts you in somebody else's space. It allows you to see the different ways to do that. Interfaith work is the same way. There's no reason why we can't respect our brothers and sisters of a different faith enough to come together on different issues that might involve our community, school system, whatever the case may be, or just to respect another person's faith. It's just about respecting and loving humanity.
And I think the bottom line is, as people of faith, we should do that as a way of life.
We should.
It's not something that we were told that we have to do.
Right.
It's something that we ought to do.
That's right. That is right.
Let's talk about that whole sense of division that you had mentioned. Unfortunately, when we take a look at some of the things that are going on in our world, but also in our own country and communities, that division sometimes has deep roots. What are some of the things that we could do or learn from that to kind of dig our way out of that?
Well, I think you have to be intentional. Coming out of your space and going into someone else's space. But it has to be intentional, because if you're not intentional, you won't do it. You'll stay where you're comfortable. Right. But just making it a priority to get to know someone of a different faith, get to know someone of a different denomination. Go worship at a different church every now and then. Those are intentional acts, but in those intentional acts, you find commonality. You really do. And so, but we have to press for that, because we're comfortable where we're at, and it's easy to stay there, but staying there is not helping the cause.
And it doesn't keep us healthy as well. You know? In our last few minutes of our time together, let's talk about that whole sin of racism. We know that it does affect us here locally. We know it affects our country and in our world. What are some of the things that we can do as people of faith beyond just respect to really make us aware of that terrible sin?
If you're a leader, if you're a faith leader or a religious leader, I think it's important to share that with your parishioners, share the concept, and then again, make opportunity for them to engage. But they need to understand that mistreating people, hatred, all of that, that God doesn't want that. That's not what He has called us to. And again, going back to the Word, preaching the Word, sharing the Word, teaching the Word, the principles that God has given to us will hopefully open their eyes to the sin of racism and their role in it and what they need to do to help change that.
I'd like to, in closing, go back to Paul's letter to Philemon or Philemon, because that whole book was basically about slavery and how he embraced Onesimus as his brother, and how important that we embrace one another as brothers and sisters, not only in the Lord, but in the human family.
Absolutely.
And how important seeing that, at least as Christians, how we do that. What would be some other ways, using Paul's words, to understand the enormity of what we are all about?
Well, and that story itself, like you mentioned, is so powerful. And this was not a practice that I think was very common at that time. So even his talking, the way he was talking, was out of the norm. But again, it was a teaching. And so we have to teach people. We have to teach them the principles of God that's already in the Word. But we need people to understand what God is saying and hope that they embrace that and that Word begins to make change in their life. But that story is an awesome story.
Well, Reverend Woodberry, thank you so much for enlightening us and being with us and lifting up the word about this whole issue of racism, but also understanding the whole sense of brotherhood and sisterhood in the Lord. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Removing Barriers was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Korda.